Morning. Let's go ahead and get started here this morning. Today our lesson is page 49, lesson 7. The screen first says, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. The lesson is obviously from the book of Ruth. Ruth is a relatively short book. It's only 4 chapters, 87 verses. Ruth is also one of 2 books in the Bible that are named after a woman, the other being Esther, and we studied that, a few months ago. And it's the only book in the Old Testament named after a non-Jew. Of course, there's only 2 books in the whole Bible that's named after non-Jews, and that would be Luke in the New Testament there. The author is unknown, and the events in this book take place mostly in Bethlehem. It was during the time of the rule of the Judges. The rule of the Judges occurred after Joshua died, after they had entered into the land of Canaan around 1376. It was till the time of Saul's became king in 1050, but probably the events in this book probably took place around 1100 BC, a little bit before that. But the book of Ruth, is, we've all familiar with, it's about a special relationship between a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law. God is rarely mentioned in the book, but it's referenced, several times. And we see that His providence is on display. He's working sort of behind the scenes, because the book starts out with tragedies. It starts out with Ruth and her husband and her 2 sons dying. But in the end, we see great joy due to their faith and commitment. Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, due to their faith and commitment to one another and to God. So we'll go ahead and get started here, and we'll go through the announcements first. Is Brian here? There he is. Okay. Okay, he's got the reader. Okay. Okay. We got a reader. Okay. Anyway. Now, who do we have to mention on our sick list? Lisa?
Really bad diabetes. His pancreas is shot. He's a young man, mid-20s, and he's on the orthodontic list, and they went down to prepare for that, and he's had an emergency crisis on lung machinery. So, Tamara's family.
Family of Tamara Heath working with Lisa. Her son has a lot of medical issues right now, so remember them. Anyone else?
My mom, Dana Ray, she had knee replacement surgery on Monday, and she could use some prayer for her recovery.
What's your mother's name?
Dana Ray.
Dana Ray. Okay. That's her, so please continue to remember her. Who else?
Mark, Joe Page got to come home. He did pretty well, I think, with his surgery.
Joe Page.
John.
Home surgery. That's John's brother. Also thanks to Alan Dolores last night for the hayride. It was a good time for all. Okay. Go ahead, Darrell.
Let us pray. Oh, Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this beautiful weather and all your many blessings. Be with the ones that are mentioned that are sick or needing care. Now be with us as we study be with us now as we study a portion of thy word. May we use it to apply it to our everyday lives. In Jesus' name, amen. This morning's reading will be from Ruth chapter 1, 1 through 5, and then 8 through 18. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Euphrates of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Oprah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there for about 10 years. Then Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the women survived her 2 sons and her husband. And Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law go return to each to their mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant them that you may find rest each in the house of their husband. So she kissed him, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they will be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons. Would you wait for them until they are grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, and her gods return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now go to chapter 4, verses 5 through 12. Then Boaz says, "On the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from the roof of the Moabites, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." And the close relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging, to confirm anything one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the confirmation of Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." So he took off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witness this day that I may have bought all that it was Elimelech's, and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth and the Moabites, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. That was the name of that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren, and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day." And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephraim and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like that, the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman.
Thanks, Darren. Okay. So again, he read there from chapter 1 and chapter 4. Skipped over chapter 2 and chapter 3, and do a quick refresher back, there in chapter 2, Naomi, we saw there at the end of one, Naomi was going to move back to her homeland, so they moved back during the harvest season. So in chapter 2, we see where Ruth went to the fields to get some food for her and Naomi, and she came across Boaz, and Boaz was the owner of the field. So that was just, Boaz was a kinsman to her late husband Elimelech. So when Boaz, and this was, she just didn't go to this field. We don't know the reason why she chose this field, but it's probably, was it by chance or was it by God's providence? And most likely it was by God's providence. But anyway, she chose this field. Boaz saw Ruth, he wanted to know who she was, and they explained to her who she was, and so he showed special favor to her, he showed special kindness, and when she left there, she left with more food than probably she should have, and when she came home, Ruth knew that something was going on there, and she asked where she had been, and she told her about Boaz, and she again told her that he was a relative of their family. And in chapter 3, we see where Ruth goes, actually Naomi, she sort of devises a plan. She has Ruth to put her best clothes on, she puts her perfume on, and she goes to the threshing floor where Boaz was working late at night, and he was asleep, and she went in, laid at his feet, and when he woke up in the middle of the night, he asked who was there. She told him, and basically she more or less just proposed to him there on the spot because she wanted him to redeem the family there, her and Naomi, and so he agrees to it, and there we see in chapter 4 where he goes before the people of the council there, the people of the city, and he becomes their redeemer, and he takes action. And in the end, of course, we don't read that part either, but in the lesson we talk about it is that, of course, Boaz is the grandfather, or it's the father of Obed, who is the grandfather of King David. So, again, it's a beautiful story there. I always hate to say a beautiful story because it sounds like it's something that's made up. It's something that actually happened, several, probably like I said, around 3,000 plus years ago there. And again, most of this happened there in Bethlehem. So we'll go ahead and get started here with these questions. Again, feel free to speak up. Any comments or... So, question number 1. During what time period did the events of this book of Ruth occur? When the judges ruled. And again, I said that was around, 1376 to 1050, from the time of Joshua's death to the time that King Saul became king there. During the time of Judges, it was if you read the last verse there in the Judges, it says, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So during that time, they came into the land of Canaan there, and Joshua had died, and of course, the first thing they did wrong, they married Canaanite women. They integrated with their culture, and it was a time of spiritual decay. It was a time of moral decay there for the children of Israel, time of idolatry. They turned away from God. And what would happen is God would allow another nation to oppress them, to come in and overtake them. And then what they would do, they would plead to God. God would bring a new king, or not a new king, but a new judge, a better judge, and he would restore them back to their prominence. And then they would so it's up in sort of ebb and flow. They would sort of good judge, bad judge, and they would sort of back and forth, turning away from God. But during this time, this is where the events of Ruth took place. So, it's a beautiful... things are happening. It was the nation was sinful. The nation had lots of problems during this time, but you see this in the background, this beautiful story that's happening here between Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. Question number 2. What does the name Elimelech mean? God is king, yeah. And again, the story here, is, Elimelech, look at his name here. Elimelech and Naomi, they were Ephrodites. They were from the land of Bethlehem, and they were a Jewish couple. There was a famine that came on the land. Again, we said, a lot of times God brought famines to correct the nation of Israel during their sins. They brought other nations to conquer them, but also, too, they would bring a famine. And so they went to a different land of Moab. What do we know about the Moabites? Are they friends or foes of the Jews? Foes, yeah. They was a pagan land. They worshiped pagan gods. So here, first of all, his name was God is King, but yet when times got rough, he left his native land, which God would probably protected him in, and went to a different land, a land of where there was God wasn't worshipped, and where there were idol worship and stuff. So he took his family and basically moved there. And we've looked in the book. We know about the Moabites. A little history here on them. The book talked about this. They were descendants of Lot. Remember, Lot went into Lot and his wife and their family moved to Sodom and Gomorrah. It was being destroyed. So when they left, they fled, and his wife was turned to a pillar of salt, and Lot had his 2 daughters. And of course, the 2 daughters, they moved into a land, and they had no offspring. So the daughters there thought that they had to have someone to take care of them. They felt like they couldn't find any husbands. So what they did, they got their father drunk. They had an incestuous relationship. One daughter did one night, the other daughter did 2. But anyway, they had 2 kids born. One was Ben-Ammi, which is an Ammonite, and the other one was Moab, and that was the king of that was where the Moabite nation came from. So the Moabites, this was an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. That's where this nation was founded. And again, they were sort of enemies there of the. I hate to say enemies, but they had a lot of issues with the Israelites there. And question number 3: Who are the 2 sons of Elimelech and Naomi? Mahlon and Chilion, yeah. And it's interesting. In that culture, a lot of times, all the names, when you had a name there, it actually had a meaning behind it. And probably Elimelech, when they was born, during the childbirth, a lot of times that's where they came up with the name. And the name of Mahlon means weak or sick, and Chilion means tired or dying. So they basically named their kids sick and tired. That was the meaning of their names there. And they obviously didn't live that long either. But there was some odd names that they had there that they were given to those 2 kids. Question number 4: Which of Naomi's daughter-in-laws chose to stay with her? Ruth, yeah. And again, that story, we'll go back over it just for a second there. When this first happened, Ruth asked those 2 daughter-in-laws both to return home. It was like, go back. It's unfortunate. You married. These were Moabite women. Ruth was an Israelite, and it was in their name. It said basically return back to your mother's homes and basically restart all over again. You're widowed women. There's no reason for you to go back with me to my land. And at first the daughters were both were wanting to go with her. They were going to stay with her. And then Ruth goes off and says, hey, listen, if I were to have a husband tonight, if I were to find a man tonight and have a child with this man, which is not going to happen, and, you're going to have to wait for that child to be born, to be raised, to the age to marry you. This is crazy. There's no reason to stay around. Go ahead and leave. So the first daughter-in-law, Orpah, she went back to her home, her family, and but Ruth, she chose to stay. And we see there in the first chapter, the part she says, she says, wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. You know, that's something we see at weddings all the time. We hear that, and that was what Ruth had told her mother-in-law. You know, she basically chose to go back with her to her homeland and to leave the land of Moab and go back to Bethlehem to live with Ruth amongst her. To live with Naomi amongst her people, the Israelites. Any comments, questions? Okay. Question number 5. What is the meaning of Ruth's name? Companion, yeah, friendship. You know, like I said a while ago, you know, the names in that time were real important. They all had meaning. Or a certain meaning. Question number 6. Which term is used to describe Boaz's role as a close relative? Goel, yeah. Yeah, Goel, you know, had different meanings. Well, not different meanings, different types of Goels. One could be like a blood avenger, like a relative or a friend that would go out and if someone who was killed or had a wrongful death, they could avenge it for him. You also had like a redeemer. Then this one was more or less like a kinsman redeemer. And, you know, like I said there in chapter 2, when Ruth came back from gleaning the fields that day, well, she went, first of all, she went to the fields to harvest it. And during that time, too, when they harvested their crops there, they had to leave the edges. They had to leave so much there. That was God's provision, God's law there, that they just didn't glean. They didn't take all the crops. They left some of it in the fields so the poor people could go out and they could glean the fields. They could get their food that way. And when they did that, you know, again, she ended up there at Boaz's field, and you know, Boaz, he came out. It was interesting too. There, you read that in chapter 2. There, he went out. He greeted the workers. You know, here he was, the owner of the fields. He was a very wealthy individual, but yet he was outside greeting the people, greeting the workers, the poor people, and asking them how their day was going, pretty much. And that's when he saw Ruth out there, and he had asked, you know, and when they told him the story about Ruth, how she came back, she was a Moabite woman who came back to Bethlehem there with her mother-in-law, how a virtuous woman she was. You know, that was, you know, to knowing that she came back with her and the commitment that she had. So, you know, we don't know about Ruth. We don't know about, I know we talked about Esther, how beautiful she was, you know. Ruth, we doesn't talk about her appearance, but we do know Ruth was beautiful on the inside, the things that she had done, and that was, and I think that's what attracted Boaz to her. But we see there in chapter, talking about the Goel, the Redeemer, there basically Boaz, when she, of course, in chapter there we talked about too there in chapter 3 when she went to Boaz in the middle of the night and Boaz, you know, basically proposed to him. He said he would redeem them. You know, Boaz wasn't first in line to redeem her. There was another relative who was ahead of Boaz. And so Boaz knew that. So that morning, he sort of, there in chapter 4, he goes to the town gate and sort of catches this guy off guard, catches him by surprise. You know, because a lot of times things were done there at the town gate. A lot of the rules, the laws were made, you know, it was there in that area. So he sort of caught this guy by surprise and saw him coming by and said, hey, wait a second, you know, in fact, we'll read it here in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. It says, Boaz went to the town gate and took a seat there. Just then the family redeemer he had mentioned came by, so Boaz called out to him, come over here and sit down, friend. I want to talk to you. So this guy has no idea what's going on. So they sat down together. Then Boaz called 10 leaders from the town and asked them to sit as a witness. And Boaz said to the family redeemer, you know Naomi who came back from Moab. She is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should speak to you about it so that you can redeem it. So this guy had first choice on it, first dibs. If you wish, if you want the lands, then you buy it here in the presence of these witnesses. But if you don't want it, let me know right away because I am the next in line to redeem it. So it would have been Boaz after you. The man said, all right, I'll redeem it. So the man at first, he agrees to redeem the land. He says, yeah, I'll do this. I'll take them. But there was a stipulation to it. First of all, he thought, well, I'll just take Naomi here. She's an older lady. I'll take her land, take care of her for a few years, and it's mine. But that's not the way it worked out. He'd buy it from her, and it would be his. But he also had to marry Ruth. And that's where Boaz was pretty creative here because he reminded her he'd have to marry Ruth, so this sort of messed up his inheritance there. Because, again, he was probably married, had a wife, or maybe more wives, I don't have, but anyway, he had already had his inheritance settled. And for them to bring in another person into the situation, and if he'd had a child with Ruth, then that child, my understanding, would have went into the inheritance there also. So that was sort of what messed his plans up. So he said, I don't want to redeem it. So he gave his chance to redeem that relationship away to Boaz. And Boaz sort of knew that when he caught him there at the town gate. He sort of caught him there and got him on the spot and had him to make a quick decision there because he wanted to redeem the relationship there with Ruth and Naomi. Any comments so far? Okay. Question number 7. What is the Hebrew word goel commonly used, translated as in Isaiah? That Redeemer, yeah. And God himself, he was a redeemer over Israel. And again, Christ was the ultimate redeemer. We'll get to here in just a moment. Question number 8. What other biblical narrative is focused on the Levirate law? Judah and Tamar, yeah. And that was a situation where her husband died, and Judah gave her second son, and he died also, so he refused to provide her with the third child, and she tricked him into fulfilling that role himself. Okay. Question number 9. Who was the child born to Ruth and Boaz? Obed, yeah. And who was he? Yeah, grandfather of King David, yeah. And question number 10. How is Ruth connected to the genealogy of Christ? Correct, yeah. And again, she's a Gentile or Moabite, and and it's of course too. You remember when David also when David was being pursued by Saul, where did he seek refuge? In land of Moab with his relatives there, you might say. So let's go over to the discussion questions now. How does Ruth's loyalty to Naomi reflect God's values for family and faithfulness? Man. Yeah. What she did, she put her first, and that's she put Naomi first there. Self-sacrifice, you might say. In the world we live in today, do we say it often? Yeah, no, but again, it's sort of a me world now. We take care of. A lot of times we have a tendency to take care of our own. And Ruth, she gave up a lot. Again, she was a young lady, and she basically went with her mother-in-law. I don't know how many women would do that for their own mother-in-laws around here, but anyway, they basically left their homeland and went with her to a different land, to a different culture. She went away from her gods, her family, her people, everything she had. She followed her husband's mother to her homeland to take care of her because she knew what would happen to Naomi when she got back to her homeland. What type of life would she have? None. If she didn't have anybody to care for her, so she basically had the life of a beggar. And that's when we see that Naomi, when Ruth met Boaz, what was she out doing that day? She was out working. She was out getting food for her. She was out providing for Naomi. She was out getting the food. That was her, basically she had, given up the chance, you might say, of having children, the chance of having her own, fulfilling her own life desires to help out her widowed mother-in-law there. And we see that too in the verse there. You said, I'll go. We talk about the verse that's used in the marriage. I'll go where you go. Your people will be my people. And so she did what was best. Instead of doing what was best for her, she did what was best for her mother-in-law there. And you think about it too. The question says, what was it? It said, God's value for family and faithfulness now. If you think that, a lot of people recite that at weddings and they take that in their vows, but, when times get hard, do people always follow through on those vows? No. If we did, we wouldn't see the divorce rate what they have in this nation we have. We wouldn't see the things that we have. People, too many times we put our selfish desires above our family. Husbands do that, wives do that. They other things that they desire more than that family relationship. But I don't think anybody goes into a wedding planning on we'll be divorced 4, 5, 10 years from now or whatever. But still, sometimes people put their selfish desires above the commitment they make to their family members. And
Naomi says, "No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much that for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has come against me."
mm-hmm. Right.
I think she saw something in her that was, enticing. Naomi exhibited those traits that she wanted to, she loved and whatnot. So it's just interesting that she left her God to go serve her God. Naomi just blamed for the disaster that came from the family.
And when Naomi also too went back into Bethlehem, she was bitter, because it said, that she changed her name. She called me Mara because God has dealt, rough with her, and she sort of, blamed God for all the bad things in her life and didn't give God credit for all the good things in her life at that point in time. But yeah, you're right. That's interesting that she would even want to, with her complaining like she did there. Question number 2. What does the word goel teach us about responsibility and compassion within a community? We say Boaz was a goel. He was the one who redeemed them. He was the one who took care of them. How does it teach us as individuals to take care of other people? What's that? Yeah.
Watch out for their
it was a legal responsibility for him at that time. The first person chose not to do it. Just like Tamar, Tamar, Judah. He chose not to fulfill that responsibility there also. But it was a responsibility. It was by law. They had to do that. That was their responsibility too. But we as Christians, it should be in our best interest to help other people. Help people who are less fortunate. Again, we live in a society. We have a government. Our government is very good at helping people out. We're to the point where $37 trillion in debt helping people out. But I'm just saying. But the point is, and helping ourselves out too. But anyway, moving past that. But the point is, the government does, but that does not negate our responsibility as human beings to help other people out. Okay, just because our government's very generous in doing that, it's something that we all have the desire to do. We should, show empathy toward those less fortunate. I think we do a good job here at the church, with the food drive and with all the stuff that goes on here at the church. The commitment we made there, but still. There's people who are less fortunate, and sometimes it's our duty to help those out. And also too,
there was a lot of that though. There wasn't, clearly you can't compare the times and the government.
All right. Mm-hmm.
But it also speaks to the family familiar responsibility to take care of widows and orphans. That was the law.
and to perpetuate the name, to keep the name, to honor them. But yeah, it's a different time by far. It is hard to compare them. But even in our time today, I think about this too, the Goel and the Redeemers and stuff, and talking about monetary values, but too, again, it's interesting, at least, at work I get to, be around a lot of different people and stuff, and in the amount of people in this community, adults or grandparents, who are taking care of grandchildren, who raise grandchildren. You worked with fathers there for years and stuff there too. That they think here it is time for them to retire, and yet they've got a 6-month-old baby that they're having to take care of, or somebody's first cousin or the third cousin. You see that a lot, and a lot of people step up to the plate and do that, and you have a lot of respect for those people because, again, we've all got our life laid out for us, what we're going to plan to do at this point in our life, and this point in our life, and this point in our life, and it's all, and things always don't turn out like you want it to. But again, you'll see people, and I've seen people in their late 70s, 80s have a 16-year-old grandchild with them, and they take, in my bless their heart, I feel sorry for both of them because, the kid doesn't have a lot of respect for the older person, and the older person don't know how to deal with the younger one. It's just a tough situation, but you'll see that a lot. But there are people who step up and do that for the kids and the grandkids and take on that family member, take on that responsibility. And again, we see it, here in the, a lot of people, are foster parents and stuff like that, but they, do a lot for people and special people there. Okay. Question number 3. How does Ruth's inclusion in the lineage of David and Jesus challenge traditional ideals about outsiders and foreigners in God's plan? What do we say about Ruth? She was a Moabite. She was non-Gentile. She was not a Jew. And also, too, you look in Jesus' lineage, there was several people. Who was Boaz? It says Boaz's mother, but who was in the lineage of Boaz? Rahab, the harlot. When they came into the land of Canaan, they sent the spies in the harlot there. Now, it says there that was Rahab's mother. Timeline is probably, a lot of times in those genealogies, they skip generations. They put it in there to show that she was in the genealogy, but if it had been his mother, it couldn't have been because that would have been like 1400 BC, and this probably all happened around 1000 BC because of the fact that she was King David's grandmother. But Boaz is probably his grandmother, his great-grandmother was probably Rahab the harlot, and she was a Canaanite. So that was where Boaz was from there. Also, too, we talked about Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. So Judah was there. He had his daughter Tamar, and we didn't finish that story, but basically she ended up having children through she dressed up as a prostitute, went to her father-in-law, and got pregnant there. So again, basically God uses ordinary people like Ruth, and God loves everyone from all different backgrounds, all different races. He loves everyone, and God's plan is for everyone. But basically Ruth's story, in a nutshell, is God took a pagan woman, Ruth, a Moabite, who was a descendant of an incestuous relationship. The Moabites were from Lot and his daughter, and they didn't worship God. They worshiped a God who believed in human sacrifices, and she was widowed, she was destined, and she was hopeless. And he brought in Boaz, and he redeemed her life and placed her in the Messianic line as the great-grandmother of King David. And 27 years after the birth of King David, Jesus was born. So he was a descendant of Ruth. So, this all goes back to, God uses, when Jesus came to the earth, he was a common man from common people, and he didn't have this great lineage, and this is pretty interesting there.
It also is prophecy for the New Testament. Christ's salvation wasn't intended for Jews alone. You know, and that was also Paul's mission to take it to the Gentiles, which would include all of the others.
Right. Yeah, and there's at least 3 women, because they said Tamar, she was not a Jew also, so there's at least 3 women there in the lineage of Christ there that were non-Jews. So it wasn't just for the Jews only. And and again, all that stuff in the Old Testament there, you read it in these prophecies and stuff, and a lot of times people think it was either prophesying about the Jewish nation, but a lot of times, if you read it, a lot of times it seems like they're prophesying about the Gentile nations being included and stuff too. It depends upon how you read into that a lot of times. But yeah, I think from the beginning of all times, it was meant for for the Gentile nation to be included in the. But during the Old Testament, a lot of times the Jews didn't understand that, and they thought they were the only ones. And they were God's chosen people, but they were chosen to preserve it, to get it to all people. And the last question is, in what ways did Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz each show courage of faith during difficult times? Questions are sometimes hard, but basically, Naomi, in her situation, at first she lost it all. She lost everything she had. She lost her husband, she lost her 2 kids, but then in the end, when she had grandson, Obed was born. That guaranteed Naomi security in her old age. And again, even though Ruth was not her bloodline, it preserved her husband's seed, not her husband, her husband's name through Obed being born, through Imelech, his land and stuff. Then Ruth, we talked about her. She left her hometown. She left all she had, basically to take care of her mother-in-law. And then Boaz. We don't talk a lot about Boaz, but what Boaz did, he's probably, we talk more about Ruth and Naomi, but what Boaz did was, admirable. I can't use that word, but what he did was he didn't have to have that responsibility. They weren't his responsibility. Boaz could say, listen, I'm not going to fool with this. Land's not worth a lot. And again, it doesn't say, but something from the first time he met Ruth, he had some sort of, he took care of her the first time he met her, whether it was because, it doesn't say anything about her beauty, but the things that she had done. He knew the type of person she was, the virtuous things that she had done, how she came from a foreign land to take care of her mother-in-law, and just knowing the type of person he was, he took responsibility from pretty much the first time he met her. He made sure that when they gleaned, he had the workers that go out there and sort of scatter food there and throw it in front of her and say, she looked down like, here it is, where'd that come from? Well, he took care of her from the first time he met her. And so, he basically followed God's laws. God's law was to take care of his family, and that was his responsibility, and he fulfilled that responsibility. So, y'all have a good week.